consequences of climate change are catastrophic. Floods, fires, droughts, rising sea levels, reduced biodiversity, and resource scarcity are but a few of the effects of failing to act. With the warmest decade on record behind us and rising emissions before us, not to mention present conversations on how to best manage climate refugees, it is unsurprising that climate change is now a leading concern among institutions and individuals around the world. This real and present threat to our planet may seem insurmountable, but there are, and have been, lessons shared on how to mitigate the damage already wrought and how to prevent future detriment. This is Megan Schaefer with the Oxford Comment. On today's episode, we explore two unique examples of societal adaptation to climate change, one from our past and one from our present. For our first interview, we spoke with Kenneth E. Seligson, the author of The Maya and Climate Change: Human Environmental Relationships in the Classic Period Lowlands. Professor Seligson shared insights into his work exploring the environmental resilience of the classic Maya, the environmental challenges they faced and overcame, and the lessons we can learn from them. Hi, Ken. Thank you so much for joining us today. Could you share a bit about yourself and your scholarship?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So I'm Ken Seligson. I am an archaeologist working in the northern Maya lowlands of Yucatan, Mexico. I am an assistant professor in the anthropology department at California State University, Dominguez Hills, and I was very happy to publish my book, The Maya and Climate Change: Human Environmental Relationships in the Classic Period Lowlands with Oxford University Press this past November. And I'm very happy to talk about some of my research from that book today.
It seems that we often refer to the collapse of an ancient civilization, but that this isn't necessarily an accurate description. Your book focuses on the ancient Maya, and in which, instead of collapse, you speak of their endurance, and in particular, their environmental resilience. Could you tell us about the climatic and environmental challenges this community faced?
Yeah, for sure. And exactly. We tend to be super fascinated as a society today by the breakdown of ancient civilizations. There's definitely a morbid curiosity angle for sure, and maybe even some Schadenfreude to some extent. But there's also, on some level, a fear about recognizing parallels between these ancient civilizations of the past and ours today, and wondering whether we're heading for a same fate. There's also maybe some hope on some level that we can learn from mistakes made by ancient civilizations and learn the key to avoiding a similar fate as they had. However, this conceptualization of the breakdown of many ancient civilizations like the Maya as a collapse can be misleading. For instance, if we think about the time scale of some of these breakdowns, the word collapse itself often connotes something happening very suddenly and all encompassingly, or a totalitarian kind of breakdown. But when we're dealing with civilizations like the classic Maya, the timescale actually spreads out over more than 200 years from the beginning to the end of this period that we refer to as the terminal classic period, or colloquially as the classic Maya collapse. So, for all we know, archaeologists 1,000 years from now will look back at the early 21st century and say we were living during the period of the early 21st century collapse. So, looking out the window, you can't tell maybe that society's breaking down, or maybe you can. But at the time, people living for many generations through this 200-year period would not necessarily have seen it as a collapse. Maybe they would have seen transformations happening in their socio-political systems, but maybe the word collapse at least needs to be broken down and explained a little bit more when it's used, because we do have some sites from the Maya lowlands, for instance, that were abandoned pretty rapidly. So you can say that individual sites, maybe even some sub-regions, did collapse. But the classic Maya civilization more broadly that spanned from northern Yucatan, Mexico, through Guatemala, Belize, western Honduras, and El Salvador, maybe didn't collapse. Maybe breakdown and transformation is a better way to think about it. There are definitely some aspects of classic Maya civilization that disappeared by the end of this transformational period. We don't really see the monument building and temple pyramid construction that we had during the height of the classic period. And then we also don't have, for instance, the divine rulership system that was in place during that time. But many other aspects of Maya civilization endured past this period. This period that we call the Classic Maya collapse started around 700, 750 AD and went through about 1000 AD, so over 200 years long. And so when we see what was going on 1000 years ago, 1300 years ago, thinking of it as a collapse can also lead to mischaracterizations about Maya civilization more broadly. When people refer to just the Maya collapse, people tend to think that maybe the Maya are a people of the past and that they collapsed and disappeared. But obviously, what changed was this socio-political system, and the Maya people and culture continued, of course, and are alive and well today, with 7 million plus Maya people in eastern Mesoamerica and around the world. So, what happened in this period, roughly 1300 to 1000 years ago, was definitely a breakdown and transformation of the socio-political system due to many different factors. But the word collapse, again, can have some connotations that might be misconstrued. But when things were changing in that period, at the end of the Classic period, there were many factors combining to lead to this breakdown and transformation, and among them was definitely climate change and environmental change. So, just developing a society so complex like the classic Maya society in a humid forest environment is super challenging to begin with. Agricultural societies like the classic Maya had to put a lot of work, effort, and time into cultivating fields in this environment where you have variable rainfall throughout the year. We tend to think of the forests of Mesoamerica and Central America as being these tropical rainforests, but that's not really the case. We're dealing with a semi deciduous forest in much of the Maya lowlands. And so there's a stark difference between the rainy and the dry seasons in most places in the Maya lowlands. For much of the year, you don't have any rain at all. In northwest Yucatan, the annual average of rain is about 20 inches, which might seem like a good amount, but it's only falling for 6 months of the year. So, really, between end of December and May, you don't get much rain at all, which is definitely a big challenge if you're trying to support large populations on agricultural subsistence base. So, just for reference, New York City gets about 50 inches of rain per year and relatively spread out throughout the year, or precipitation at least. Yeah, so if you have almost all of your rain just falling for 6 months of the year, you have to develop some pretty intricate ways to capture and store water. So, for several centuries, at the beginning of the Classic period, which began around 150 or 200 AD, it appears that the Maya across the lowlands could count on a fairly stable climate, at least predictable rainfall every year during the rainy season. But things began to change in the late Classic period, and by about 600, 700 AD, rainfall became inconsistent in a lot of areas. So this wasn't the first time that Maya people and Maya culture dealt with destabilized climate and environmental changes. But in this case, we have evidence that around 750, 800 AD, mega droughts started to affect different parts of the lowlands, where you had a decrease in rainfall for periods of 30 to 20 years. The area where I work in the northern lowlands, called the Puc region, which means hill in Yucatec Mayan, this hilly region doesn't have any surface water at all. People living in the Puc relied completely on rainfall for their daily water needs and for watering their fields. So they developed very intricate ways to capture and store water during the rainy season to last them through the dry season. But if there is little to no rain at all during what should be the rainy season, it's impossible to live in that area for more than a few years. So we do see people leaving the Puc region in the mid 900s AD. And in other parts of the lowlands, because we do have these microclimates and microenvironments, things are very different across the lowlands in different subregions. In some places, you might have had these mega droughts punctuated by really powerful hurricanes, which can be super destructive on their own. So, across the Maya lowlands during the Classic period, and especially leading towards the end of the Classic period, Maya communities developed many ways to deal with and face these challenges wrought by climate change and environmental changes.
You talk about Maya ingenuity when it came to harnessing environmental resources, and how there are several general lessons we can learn from the classic Maya about long term survival in the wake of climate instability. Could you expand on this?
Yeah, so about 700 years before the period of breakdown and reorganization that we know as the classic Maya collapse, there was another period of breakdown and transformation called the pre-classic collapse. That was linked also on some level to climate instability and environmental change. After several massive sites were depopulated during this period and people spread out across the landscape in new settlement patterns and founded new urban centers and new towns, and then we eventually get to the massive classic Maya civilization that we know and love today. They demonstrated that they had learned from earlier mistakes and began to do some things differently. So they developed subsistence and natural resource management practices that really reflected the natural ecosystems of their local environments. Because again, across the lowlands, there are many different microenvironments. There are wetland areas, there are higher canopy forests, there are scrub forests across the north. They developed agricultural and water management practices that really reflected the local conditions. So they didn't try to impose one system across the entire area. They built new sites to serve as massive water capture and storage mechanisms. So maybe you've heard of the site of Tikal in Guatemala, one of the preeminent classic period Maya sites. The whole site kind of serves as a funnel to capture rain during the rainy season and funnel it into these reservoirs. Even individual Maya households, their little plazas, their patio areas, were slightly angled, ever so slightly, to tip the water into storage areas. In the Puc region where I work, in addition to having surface reservoirs that could help feed a community or help provide water for a community, individual households had their own subterranean storage cisterns that they would funnel water into by slightly angling everything in their local residential complexes to tip the water into these reservoirs. So they weren't wasting anything when the rain came. They wanted to make sure they captured and stored everything. We've been having massive rainfalls in Southern California, at least by Southern California standards, these last couple of months. But so much of the water is just directed directly out to sea, out to the ocean, because they had structured the whole water management system to avoid flooding a long time ago. And we're still dealing with the effects of that. I think things are changing now. But definitely one clear lesson we could learn is to capture and store the water that we do have access to when it does come. My colleague Lisa Lucero mentioned to my students the other day that in the United States today, there are 11 million swimming pools. Just trying to let that sink in. And this is obviously water that is not good for drinking and is not cannot be used to help grow any plants or anything like that. And she suggested that an easy fix would be if some people, instead of having a chlorinated pool in their backyard, had a more natural pond in their backyard that could still be used for swimming and recreational activities, but could also be functional. So that's just a nice little tip there from Dr. Lucero. But the Maya also practiced sustainable forest harvesting. So they got so much food and medicine and lumber and firewood from the forests, and they developed ways to make sure that they did not use up these resources, and they planned ahead. Again, up where I work in the Puc region, we see the local communities adapting a new way to make burnt lime. And burnt lime was a material used for so many things in classic Maya society. It was used to make the mortar and the stucco that held their massive structures together. It was also used to treat corn to make it more nutritious. So even today, if you buy a bag of corn flour, it'll say that it's been lime treated or nishtamalized, to use the Nahuatl term, because without treating corn with lime or another alkaline substance, it's really not that nutritious. So burnt lime was key to so many aspects of classic Maya society. And as far as we knew, the main way to make it was making a massive wooden pyre above ground and having it burn in on itself like an above ground oven to cook these little pieces of limestone to make burnt lime. But that uses a massive amount of wood fuel to do that. And in the Rook region where I work, towards the end of the classic period, we see a massive population spike and a massive construction boom. And it looks like they were planning ahead for this because they began to adopt a new technology for making burnt lime, in which they built pit kilns that helped trap the heat and protect from the wind and probably used less wood fuel to make the burnt lime in that case. So they took a proactive approach. And so we see this population boom sustained for over 200 years in the Puc region until lack of rainfall forced people to leave the area. We also see the classic Maya maximizing their wetlands for agricultural uses. Across the lowlands, we have these areas called bajos, or low-lying areas that would become kind of swampy and fill with water during the rainy season. And we're now finding, thanks to LiDAR airborne laser scanning, areas where they cultivated these wetlands and made these wetland fields with raised areas, almost similar to the Aztec chinampas. And we know that they were replenishing soil using a whole wide range of fertilizers. They also, again, tailored their subsistence practices to these microenvironments across the lowlands. It was not a homogeneous system all across the area. They also developed trade networks where they plugged into these social networks in which one area could supply another area. If they were dealing with a particularly harsh period in their local microclimate, they could rely on neighbors in different regions. And then when the time came, when many sites did begin to be depopulated during the late interminal Classic period, especially across the southern lowlands, there's evidence that certain parts of the northern lowlands likely absorbed migrant populations from other parts of the lowlands into the population, and they made plans to have this flexibility to allow for a growth in local populations and the strain that it would put on resources. The fact that we see changes made to how they were making burnt lime and doing some other things around 600, 650 AD, and then this population growth continued for another 200, 250 years, shows the benefits of this proactive approach and developing a flexible pattern. So towards the end of the Classic period, towards the end of this period that we know as the collapse, there's no getting around it that a lot of these massive population centers like Tikal in Guatemala and Palenque in Mexico, they were depopulated. People spread out from these larger urban centers into smaller groups, mostly living near natural sources of fresh water. So flexibility, building systems from the start that could be adapted to changing circumstances and that can survive worst case scenarios, at least for a certain amount of time. That is a key lesson that we can learn from the classic Maya about how to survive through periods of climate change. But then there's another key lesson that we can learn as well about adaptability.
We're arguably in or even past the defining moment with regards to climate, with many countries declaring a climate emergency. Do you see contemporary parallels with the challenges the ancient Maya faced? And if there's one attitude or lesson we must learn, what is that?
Great question. Yeah. We are definitely dealing with climate change today on an even more massive scale, possibly than the Maya were dealing with 1,000 years ago. One thing people point to is that one of the main differences is that the climate change we are dealing with today was definitely human modified or human induced on a level that was not possible 1,000 years ago. Some colleagues of mine have actually done some studies and argued that clearing a lot of the forest land for agriculture in the Maya lowlands may have exacerbated the droughts that ended up affecting the region, but that human-made climate change was definitely not on the scale that we're affecting the climate today. But despite the differences perhaps in the causes of the climate change that we're dealing with today and what the Maya dealt with over 1,000 years ago, there are definitely some overarching lessons that we can learn from the Maya. And honestly, the most important thing that we can learn is the willingness to adapt. We have a much more in-depth knowledge of how our climate and environments are changing and why. We have really all the tools and knowledge necessary to change the trajectory that we're on, but it's the willingness that's not really there right now. We saw that the Maya adapted their practices after the pre-classic collapse and adopted new ways of making sure their natural resource management systems were that much more in tune with what the natural ecosystems would want. But then we also see people taking the ultimate step towards the end of the terminal Classic period and leaving urban centers for smaller groups of population centers, focusing on areas where you do have natural water resources for living. We recognize that we need to recognize really that nothing lasts forever. The way society is set up today may seem like the culmination of centuries of progress, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily the only way to live or the best way to live. So it's kind of grim to think of it that way. But if we think of it in a more positive lens, through a more positive perspective, change is always going to happen. Just because we've been doing things a certain way for now, it doesn't mean it's the right way or the only way. We see how the Maya took a proactive approach to things like changing up how they were making a key material that they needed for so many aspects of society. They took action before things got too bad. We can still be proactive today, even though we've passed some thresholds that are very, very concerning and scary. It doesn't mean all is lost. We can still plan ahead. We need to recognize that all aspects of our global societies today are connected, and that water conservation cannot necessarily be sectioned off from agricultural sustainability or forest management and addressed on its own. They're all interconnected. So really, the main lessons that we can learn from the classic Maya are the importance of knowledge, planning, and structural flexibility, and again, the willingness to adapt what we've been doing now for some time.
Thank you again for joining us today. We appreciate you sharing your scholarship with us.
Thank you so much, Megan. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
For our second interview, we welcome Scott M. Moore, the author of China's Next Act: How Sustainability and Technology Are Reshaping China's Rise and the World's Future. He addressed contemporary China's meteoric and controversial rise to a global power, its leading role in sustainability and technology, and what this means for countries and institutions around the world. Hi, Scott. Thank you so much for joining us today. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and the research that you do?
Absolutely, Megan, and thank you so much for having me today on the podcast. Very happy to be here. China's Next Act, the book that we're here to talk about, is actually my second with OUP. So thrilled to have that relationship. And really, my research in China's Next Act really started from an experience that I had working outside academia in the world of policy for the U.S. Department of State on something called the China Desk, which is the office that handles US China relations. And I had the opportunity to work there soon after finishing graduate school and had a portfolio that's called Environment, Science, Technology, and Health. And I have to tell you that for somebody coming out of graduate school, where the focus is really on relentless specialization, showing up and kind of being told you're responsible for covering all of these issues: environment, science, technology, health, really seemed somewhere between laughable and maybe downright dangerous to expect one person to kind of cover all of those different areas. But actually, at least when it comes to China, that proved to be a really interesting brief to have, especially when I was there back in 2015, 2016, because in that period, public health and climate change both became very significant and central issues in the US China relationship. This was the period leading up to the Paris Agreement on climate change. And really, we saw in that period these sort of newer, less familiar environmental and technological issues move from being important but somewhat marginal issues in the US China relationship to among the most important. And that observation, that shift, has really been what I've tried to explain and explore through my research, both trying to look at how that shift has affected China's foreign policy, its relationship with the US and other countries, and what that means for China's role in tackling shared global challenges like climate change. And in the last couple of years, of course, what all that means in light of growing tensions and rivalry between China and other countries, most notably the United States.
In recent years, China has pushed the visibility of their global influence. In which areas is this most evident, and in which areas would they prefer their influence to be most evident?
So, one of the big themes of China's Next Act, and really my work more generally, is that China's role in the world is increasingly being shaped by developments in two big issue areas. One is sustainability, and I include in that category public health, as well as climate change and other environmental issues, and emerging technology. And I think one example of how China's image and role in the world and influence is being affected by developments in those two areas is in climate change. And I would argue that climate change is probably the global issue in which China has had most success in gaining credibility and recognition as a great power that is equal in stature to the world's other great powers, the United States, the European Union, Japan, etc. That credibility and standing and recognition is due mostly to China's role as the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, and especially carbon dioxide emissions. China has been the largest emitter since the early 2000s. And it's used that significance and that standing in international climate talks and negotiations to portray itself both to the international community and even more importantly to its own domestic population and audience as a country that is not only willing but able to tackle some of the most complex shared global governance challenges that face the world today. Another sort of theme I explore in the book, though, is how China's role in addressing these shared global challenges like climate change has really been complicated by geopolitical tension and rivalry with other countries. And one example of that is how China's standing in international climate issues has shifted just over the last half a year or so, partly in response to tensions over Taiwan, in the aftermath of which China, for a time, suspended climate dialogue with the United States. And then at the most recent UN climate conference, COP27 in November, where really for the first time you saw concerted pressure placed on China by other developing countries to increase its financial support for climate adaptation. That's really a new issue and a new sort of demand placed on China, and one that called its standing in international climate talks and policy into question. So we are seeing that position shifting pretty rapidly, but it's an example, I think, of how China's broader foreign policy, its efforts to project soft power and enhance its standing more broadly, have increasingly been focused in the ecological and technological domains.
What impact has China's recent focus on sustainability and technology had on their economy and on their foreign and domestic policy?
So this is another, in some ways, the central reason that I argue that sustainability and emerging technology are so important to how we should be thinking about China's rise and its role in the world. On one hand, China is very heavily impacted by climate change and by climate risk. And we saw that in very dramatic fashion just last summer when China was subject to what's almost certainly the most severe heat wave on record in terms of its duration, its intensity, the number of people affected, probably suppressed China's GDP growth for 2022 by about 0.3%. Very significant issue. On the other hand, China's leaders have for some time, and we're really talking about going on 15 years or so, been pretty convinced that adopting a very ambitious set of objectives to expand clean energy production and deployment is essential for China's economic future. And they really see investment in those areas, clean technology, as important drivers of growth for China going forward, and an important way to help shift China and its economy away from this currently pretty resource intensive, export led, low value added manufacturing economy to one that is much less polluting, higher value added, more high tech, and more focused on domestic consumption and investment. Those two really go together. On the other hand, China has invested very, very significantly in the adoption and development of emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, robotics, quantum computing, in part as a way to address some very serious economic challenges that are on the horizon, like demographic change. And this came into the news just a couple of weeks ago when it emerged that in 2022, China's population fell for the first time since the 1960s. And that really underscored the fact that China faces an impending demographic crunch. In order to escape the drag that would place on growth, China's going to have to increase productivity very rapidly, which is where artificial intelligence, robotics, et cetera, come into play. So, both in the sustainability and technology arenas, you're really seeing those areas start to play a really, really important role in China's economic development trajectory, and by extension, its policy in many different areas, including foreign policy. And we talked a little bit about how that is reflected in China's role in international climate talks. Another example is in development and overseas investment, where the Belt and Road is sort of the signature Chinese strategic policy in that space. And what you've seen over time is that being shifted from essentially high volume, very large mega project investment to smaller scale and at least rhetorically more sustainable investments that take greater account of the environmental and social impacts of Chinese funded projects in third countries. So, another example, I think, of how these sort of sustainability considerations have really started to shape China's policy in a bunch of different areas.
What does this more complex China picture mean for foreign governments and for businesses?
Basically, and this is another kind of key dilemma that I wrestle with in the book, China's indispensable in tackling shared global challenges, whether it's climate change, preventing future pandemics, or regulating the development of emerging technologies. And in the book, I talk a lot about gene editing. As well as artificial intelligence and technologies that really do pose some significant risks for safety, security, privacy, human rights. And it's really pretty much impossible to have a global solution to those shared global challenges without China. At the same time, cooperation with China, and in particular the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, and the Chinese state, has become a lot more difficult for several reasons. One is this growing geopolitical tension and rivalry that I mentioned earlier. But another has to do with developments in areas like human rights, where growing repression, violations of human rights in places like Xinjiang have really sort of created a moral and ethical dilemma for foreign governments, for foreign businesses, for foreign organizations in engaging with Chinese partners. And I don't think any of those issues mean that we shouldn't be pursuing cooperation and looking for areas to work together. But they definitely complicate matters. And I think what that means for foreign governments and businesses is that they have to think very carefully and deliberately about exploring engagement and partnership with Chinese counterparts. There are a couple specific strategies I talk about in the book, but particularly for companies. I think every country really needs a core sort of China vision and mission statement that reflects its core values. And it does take account of moral and ethical dilemmas, in addition to thinking about more immediate political and economic pressures, including now export control restrictions and different policies that are likely to really complicate trade and investment, cross-border data flows, all of those things that are very important to private sector operations of foreign firms in China. The kind of tagline is that all of these issues are becoming much more complex, and that means that decisions have to be a lot more deliberate. They have to be rooted in core values, and they also have to, I think, take account of risk along a growing number of dimensions: political, economic, geopolitical, as well as moral, ethical.
You mentioned that tackling shared global challenges such as climate change will be difficult, if not impossible, without China. Why is this the case? And are there other global challenges for which you feel cooperation with China is imperative?
So there are two linked aspects of China's rise over the past 40 years that I talk about in the book, and that I think really underpin this importance, this central importance of China in tackling shared global challenges. And one is the emergence of China as really the central node for global manufacturing. There really is no alternative to China when it comes to the physical production of manufactured goods. And while we're seeing a lot of supply chains shift and reorient in response to the pandemic, to geopolitical concerns and rising wages in China, lots of different factors. The fact is, there's really no country positioned to supplant China as the center of the world's manufacturing industry. And what that means is that China is the single biggest and most important player when it comes to addressing most global environmental issues. In particular, climate change, that's the most visible example where one kind of implication of that dominance in manufacturing is that China has the highest emissions. And that's true not just in total aggregate terms, but also in terms of China's carbon intensities, the amount of carbon dioxide that China's economy emits to create a given unit of production is about twice that of the European average, for example. But it also means that when you think about things like as a driver of mineral extraction or natural resource extraction around the world, China is the single biggest driver because it's taking those raw material inputs and creating manufactured goods using them. So China has really become the central node for all of these pressures on the world's ecosystems and its natural resources. On one hand, and on the other hand, China has kind of stood out among other developing countries in the amount of resources and policy support that it's given to developing advanced emerging technologies. Artificial intelligence is a great example. And because of that level of investment and support, China has emerged as an indispensable country when it comes to the regulation of these same emerging technologies. It's basically impossible to envision an effective global sort of set of rules or norms and standards that try to mitigate some of the risks posed by development of artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies that doesn't include China because of the amount of investment and attention that it has paid to the development of these sectors and technologies. And that's distinct from a lot of other developing countries. There are some exceptions. India is also a significant player when it comes to artificial intelligence and things like that. But really, China stands out even among some of those other countries in terms of the scale of its investment and the amount of activity that's going on in research, development, and deployment of these emerging technologies. So, for that reason as well, China is really indispensable on the emerging technology side as well as on the ecology and sustainability side.
How advanced is Chinese strategy with regards to technology and sustainability when compared to the other great powers?
I think in terms of the actual strategy and policy, it's at least as, and probably in many respects, more advanced. And again, thinking about areas like artificial intelligence or biotechnology, there are these very detailed and in many cases, fairly long-standing plans to really try to catapult China to leadership positions in these technologies, kind of effectively skipping a couple generations of technological development that you've seen in other countries, including the U.S. What isn't quite as well developed, though, are some of the institutional infrastructure pieces that supports innovation and advanced research and development in those areas. So, if you look at highly innovative economies and ecosystems that you see in places like certain parts of the US, Silicon Valley, Israel, other places around the world, there are a lot of sort of social and really sort of cultural and organizational factors that really seem to play a significant role in making those ecosystems so productive. And there are things like very dense and sort of frictionless ties between government, between private sector entities, universities, other key kind of actors in innovation, norms around things like tolerating and even venerating failure, which is is very common when it comes to technological development and particularly trying to make money off of it or find useful applications for it. And a lot of these kind of more soft aspects of innovation infrastructure still aren't as well developed in China. And that's partly just a process of development and catching up. But there are also some structural things that impede the development of that kind of more software to the innovation ecosystem. And it's things like authoritarian control of information, disincentives for cross organization and interdisciplinary collaboration, the perception and in some cases the reality of kind of state persecution really of entrepreneurs in certain sectors. So all of those factors are systemic barriers to the development of innovation ecosystems in China like those we see elsewhere. That doesn't mean that China is not a really significant player in technology. As I mentioned earlier, it is and will become even more indispensable going forward. It also doesn't mean that China is not capable of producing really significant innovations. And we have seen a couple of examples of that already. I would argue that WeChat is a very innovative tool and platform that we don't really have an analog for elsewhere in the world. There are more industry and sector specific examples in areas like cancer therapeutics and things like that. So it's not the case that there's sort of like a black and white difference between China and other countries in terms of the ability to innovate, but there are these sort of systemic issues that I think call into question the overall ability of Chinese firms and institutions to necessarily match the productivity on a per capita basis to what we see elsewhere. Final point on that, though, is that I don't think that should be any kind of source of complacency for policymakers or executives who are concerned about competitiveness and ability to compete with Chinese firms and institutions in developing advanced technology. And we do see that Chinese firms and institutions have demonstrated lots of advantages in commercialization and deployment. I think there are a lot of lessons and reasons to reinvest in research and development enterprises in the U.S. and elsewhere.
You mentioned how in some areas competition can be good for the planet, but in other areas, such as artificial intelligence and other disruptive new technologies, it could be catastrophic. Could you elaborate further on this?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. And you're right, that is an argument I make in the book. So typically, we think of these sort of global challenges like climate change as things that really require cooperation between countries to properly address. Whereas, and as we were just sort of talking about, emerging technologies, it's sort of become accepted to think about those as areas of competition. Chinese firms or Chinese institutions are they in the lead? Are they sort of outstripping competitors in the U.S. or elsewhere? Sort of become common to think of those issues as areas of economic, if not geopolitical, competition. But one of the things I argue in the book is that that kind of framing may have it more or less backwards in the sense that there are a couple of examples of ways in which I think economic or geopolitical competition can help promote, particularly clean energy development. Whereas you really do, I think, need some level of international cooperation to properly tackle these challenges related to emerging technologies. So one example I point to in where competition might actually be good for the planet is the Inflation Reduction Act passed in the U.S. This past summer. If everything goes as planned, the estimates suggest that that piece of legislation could reduce U.S. emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, by about 45% as we head toward the middle of the century. What's significant about that is that in his message to Congress saying, if you pass this bill, I will sign it, President Biden specifically referred to the need for this legislation in order to help equip the United States to compete more effectively with China, including in clean energy development. And I hasten to say that I don't think sort of competition is necessarily the best or only reason you want to invest in clean energy and clean technology. But if it gets us a 45% reduction in US emissions, that's really something worth thinking about. In other words, I think what we can take away from that is the lesson that there is something politically quite appealing about using this argument about competition and competitiveness to convince politicians to invest in clean energy and clean technology. So I think in that respect, there is some promise to how competition can help drive action on climate change. On the other hand, as I mentioned, in order to really make progress in regulating these emerging technologies, and one risk I talk about in the book is around gene editing and the possibility that either deliberately or mistakenly a researcher somewhere in the world ends up creating a dangerous kind of organism or new virus or whatever using gene editing techniques that then gets released into the environment and causes havoc. It's hard to see how you could really prevent something like that from happening and really controlling access to potentially dangerous genetic material without some type of new international agreement, which is going to require international cooperation. So that's really where that argument and observation comes from. But I do think it's something we should be thinking much more about, the need for greater cooperation when it comes to emerging technologies, even if there is maybe a little bit more of a role for competition on the climate and environmental side of the equation.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today, Scott, and thank you for sharing your scholarship with us.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, Megan.
We want to thank our guests, Kenneth E. Seligson and Scott M. Moore, for speaking with us about climate change, sustainability, the classical Maya, and contemporary China. Please explore our show notes on the OUP blog for a recommended reading list exploring just a few of the ideas and themes discussed today. New episodes of the Oxford Comment will premiere on the last Tuesday of each month. Be sure to follow Oxford Academic on Facebook, Twitter, SoundCloud, and YouTube to stay up to date on upcoming podcast episodes. While you're at it, please do subscribe to the Oxford Comment wherever you regularly listen to podcasts, including Apple, Google, and Spotify. Lastly, we want to thank the crew of the Oxford Comment for their assistance on today's episode. Episode 81 was produced by Stephen Filippi, Patrick Horton-Wright, and me, Megan Schaefer. Thank you for listening.